With it being the start of the new year, I figured it would be a great time to look into which of the flagship handhelds are the best. I am a human though, so I will have some bias, but I did try to stay as objective as I could in my reviews. With that said, welcome to the Bread Box. I'll be ranking the PlayStation Portal, Steam Deck, and Nintendo Switch 2 on a scale of 1 to 5 in the following categories: battery life, price, ergonomics and design, portability, and the big one, performance. I'll also cover basic information for each portable as I introduce them. Now with that said, I'll be going through them in release date order, so... The Steam Deck, released on February 25th, 2022, was Valve's foray into the world of portable systems. And I've got to say, it was definitely an effort. While opinions on the success of this portable PC may vary, one thing is for sure: it got plenty of new people into PC gaming, which in turn made Valve a lot of money from the amount of new people they gained buying games off of Steam. I didn't have a Steam Deck for a long time, but one of my friends would constantly rave about how much they loved theirs, so it made me want one, and after some patience and deal hunting on Facebook Marketplace, I found this one for $200. Now if you can find a 512 gig like I have for that much, then it's a no-brainer. Enough of my personal experience, let's talk about the specs on this thing. It has a custom AMD APU and 16 gigs of RAM. For a long time, I had no interest in the Steam Deck because of the whole Linux thing, but the specs of this thing are pretty good. The LCD Steam Deck came in 3 models, 64, 256, and 512 gig models, with all of them being able to add more storage with a microSD card, with the prices of each model increasing along with the storage. 64 gigs was $399.99, 256 gigs was $529.99, and the 512 gig was $649.99. But those were prices when this thing was released back in 2022, and honestly, those prices are high as hell. But now we're in 2026 and things have changed. There is only one way to get an LCD model now, and that is the used market. Which is how I recommend getting pretty much any piece of technology, because buying something from someone who took good care of their tech a few years after it came out is much better than spending potentially hundreds more on a piece of new tech, in my opinion at least. Anyway, the Steam Deck can be found on the used market now for around $400 without any deal hunting. The last thing that needs to be discussed with this thing is the display, which is kinda lacking. While I recognize this is the oldest system here, a 1280 by 800p resolution is just not that great. But I'm not too stubborn to admit that, honestly, this small 7-inch screen looks pretty good with it. And with a typical 60Hz refresh rate, you can't go wrong looking at this display. Now that you've gotten acquainted with the Steam Deck, let's move on to one of its rivals. Next in our timeline is the PlayStation Portal. November 15th, 2023 was the day we got to get our hands on this thing, although I think most people just glanced at it while walking through Walmart and let them rot behind the glass lock cabinets. It sold between 1 and 2 million units, and yeah, this thing was a total flop. And it's honestly not hard to see why. The launch was catastrophic to the popularity of this PlayStation accessory. Yeah, that's right. That's what Sony sees this as, an accessory, because when it came out, you could only play games streaming from your PS5. But, as of a few months ago, you can actually use this thing by itself to play games from the cloud. Only PS Plus Premium members are awarded this luxury, but technically this can be a standalone system now. Now the hardware inside it is, well, terrible. On the processing side, it's running a Qualcomm Snapdragon 680, which came out in late 2021, and it's meant for like mid-range smartphones, definitely not gaming devices. And the RAM doesn't make it any better. While I couldn't find any reliable sources, this random guy on Reddit said that people who hacked the PS Portal saw that it had 6 gigs of RAM, which is nowhere near enough for running a PlayStation 5 game. Which is why I guess they decided to make it a streaming device. And due to streaming everything, it has 0 storage. But the price is okay, I guess, coming in at a whopping $199.99. Although you can find them for closer to $150 used. The last thing we need to talk about is the display, and it's really quite nice. Coming in at a respectable 8 inches and 1080p with a 60Hz refresh rate, this is the largest screen of the three, and it is extremely pleasant to use. Originally, I was going to talk about the PS5 specs because they are what the PS Portal's running on, but it doesn't deserve that. And since it can do cloud gaming now, I'll judge it as a solitary device like the other two are. Now, onto the last competitor. The most recent of these systems, the Nintendo Switch 2, was released on June 5th, 2025. While it has only been around for a little over 7 months, the Nintendo Switch 2 has sold around 12.5 million units, which is the fastest selling console, ever. I guess after forcing us to play on a glorified Kindle for 8 years, the hype really built up for the new console. And maybe this hype is warranted, as the Switch 2 is the only modern system to run off of an NVIDIA processor. Though the RAM is not quite as substantial as most would like, coming in at only 12 gigs, and that is a weird number because most modern DIMMs come in multiples of 8 rather than 6. But the storage is a great increase from the previous Nintendo systems, as the Switch 2 comes with 256GB of onboard storage with an express microSD card slot, which, although expensive, it's pretty quick when it comes to load times. The big bonus of the Switch 2 is that new screen. With a 7.9-inch HDR display that goes between 60 and 120 Hz, I think you'll find it hard to be disappointed with the look of the new display. Now, the largest point of contention for most people is the price of the Nintendo Switch 2. There are 2 price points for it. You can buy the console and a game bundle for $500, or you can buy the console without a game for $450. And personally, as someone who isn't a big fan of Mario Kart myself, I'm going to go with the $450 price point for this competition. Another component of this is that none of the other systems here come with the game, so it's far more fair to choose the option most like the others. And one thing that's great about the Switch 2 is that you get to use this. Unlike the other 2 options, physical media is still supported. Now that I've introduced you to the contestants, I can begin giving them a score of 1 through 5 slices on the breadbox scale. Continuing the theme of chronological order, we'll be looking at the battery life of these systems, starting with the Steam Deck. Now, none of these handhelds have a particularly impressive battery life, and the Steam Deck is a prime example of this, as it has a max of 8 hours with extremely light use, and as low as 2 hours when playing more intense games. If you want a system to play some indie games and watch some videos, then this battery won't be an issue. Hell, even if you want to play some demanding games for an hour or 2, you'll be fine. But if you're the kind of person who plays a story game from start to finish or for hours at a time, then you'll definitely have an issue with this battery life. So I'll give it a 3 out of 5. The PlayStation Portal is actually the most impressive of the 3 when it comes to battery life because all it has to do is stream games from a system that's actually doing all the heavy lifting, with around 5 hours while using a medium to bright screen and 8 hours with a dim screen. And as much as I hate to admit it, this is a pretty nice battery life in the modern age, especially when taking into account that when you have a good Wi-Fi connection there is little to no latency, and it feels as if you're playing the game natively. So, surprisingly, I'm gonna give this a 4 out of 5, and honestly, I feel like it earned that score. I mean, look at how thin this thing is. That small of a battery powering this thing for that long deserves a good score. Now, the Switch 2 severely underperforms here, and there's no way to sugarcoat it. The battery sucks in this. It maxes out at around 6.5 hours with light gaming, and it can go as low as about 2 hours. Which makes sense as they kept the same thickness as the Switch 1, and that had to come at some cost. But like I said with the Steam Deck, if you're the kind of person who plays games for an hour or 2, then you'll have no issues with it. But if you're really desperate to keep playing, just put it in its dock, play on your TV for a bit while it charges, and use the Joy-Con as a controller. And that's a pretty nice feature to have when you consider that neither of the other handhelds have the ability to do that out of the box. All in all, the Switch 2 gets a 3 out of 5, mainly because I feel like the ability to play in the dock makes up for the lackluster battery.
Goo goo gaga.
In the modern market, price has become a big talking point. As with each new system, the price increases to the point that a new PC handheld can cost you upwards of $1,000. While the Steam Deck may not have been that high at launch, it was extremely expensive, costing $650 for a 512GB model, and it came out 2 years after the PS5, which was $150 cheaper and much more powerful. However, in 2022, there were no other products that hit the demographic the Steam Deck was made for. And if you were comfortable with the 256GB model, then you would only pay $530, which is still way too expensive, but eventually Valve lowered the price of the Steam Deck to $400, which made it much more accessible to the average consumer, which is what it can still be found for on the used market. While I am mainly comparing this to other game systems, this thing is technically an entire PC in your pocket. Well, probably in your backpack or something. But you can do pretty much anything a computer can do on this. Emulate games, type essays, reply to emails, and all the other boring things that computers are used for. So for $400, this is an extremely cost-effective way to get into PC gaming, as well as maybe using it for emails or something, I don't know. But I feel like most people are just going to use their phones for that anyway. So for $400, I think the Steam Deck gets a 5 out of 5. Now the PlayStation Portal, this glorified Wii U pad ripoff, has very little to offer in terms of value, but it is extremely cheap. While it was released for $200 initially, you can find these very commonly for around $150 on the used market. And while that may seem like a good price at first, you have to take into account that you either have to pay an extra $350-ish for a used PS5, or you have to pay $18 a month for PS Plus Premium. And that's just to be able to use the thing and stream games, and that adds up pretty quickly. While on the other options here, you can buy the system and play free games for a while until you feel like spending some more money on a game, the PS Portal is a non-stop spending spree. And for that, I feel like it only deserves a 2 out of 5. Now, we get into the system that everyone has a very strong opinion about. So, please don't come after me and my family if I don't agree with yours. Okay, the Switch 2 system was released at $450 and is so new that you'll really only find it around that price. It's about as powerful as a PS4 Pro, which is pretty impressive for a handheld with such a thin and sleek design. I mean, the Steam Deck is much larger and much less powerful. And for only $50 more than a Steam Deck, I don't think this is a terrible purchase. The Steam Deck can emulate older games and the Switch 2 can't, but they have Nintendo Online for $20 a year. Unless you want the better version with N64 and GameCube, then you're paying $50 a year, which to their credit is much less than Sony or Xbox. But we're not comparing the Switch 2 to those. So for the power of a PS4 Pro in your hands, with a 7.9-inch screen, 120Hz refresh rate, not even mentioning those mouse controls that no one asked for, I feel like $450 is a pretty fair price. But due to online being a paid subscription, although relatively cheap, I will only give the Switch 2 a 4 out of 5 on pricing.
I am at the bottom! I am 3 down!
You should take advantage of your God mode.
What the hell? What the fuck?
The next category is ergonomics and design, and since that's a very vague description, I'll explain what I'm judging on here. I'm looking at the comfortability of the handheld because everyone knows how bad it is when you're playing a game and get a cramp because the controller sucks. And by design, I mean gimmicks and innovative features and how well they work and complement the system. So without further ado, let's just get into it. The Steam Deck is extremely blocky and thick, and is not very comfortable for someone with smaller hands like me. And the choice to cram everything at the top of the system while making it symmetrical and while visually appealing, it makes me feel as if I have to reach to use joysticks and press face buttons. I recognize that this may not be an issue with people with bigger hands, but it's my experience and that's all I can judge off of. But once I got used to it, it wasn't that bad. One thing I do hate on any controller or system is when they make their bumpers flat to the console. There's hardly any travel on these, and it is a big complaint for me as I think I press it down, but my finger was pressing on the plastic in front of it and blocking the input from registering. How hard is it to just elevate the bumpers a little bit? And the last thing that bothers me with this thing is that it gets hot while playing demanding games. Like it feels like you've pressed your hand to a space heater when you touch the back after playing for a while. Anyways, now that I've listed my grievances, we can talk about the cool things the Steam Deck does, like these. The trackpads here are a really cool addition, and they're very useful in a lot of games, as they can give you more accurate aim and in some games even act as a mouse. I have nothing negative to say about them as they are really cool additions, and although the left one is usually just a D-pad, I'm glad Valve decided to put them on this thing. The actual design of this portable is really cool. It looks sleek and unique with the all-black shell being a basic but nice look. All in all, while I don't like some things about the ergonomics, I think that the score is made up in the design of the gimmicks and just how well they're used with this device. So I'm going to give the Steam Deck a 4 out of 5 in ergonomics and design. The PlayStation Portal, on the other hand, is really hard to dislike. Now I know that some people prefer the feel of an Xbox controller, but I have been a PlayStation guy for my whole life. So the PlayStation layout is the most comfortable for me, and since the PS Portal is the exact same layout as the PS4, PS5 controller, it feels as if you're playing with one because you pretty much are, only a little heavier. However, the system is the lightest of the three, weighing in at 532 grams, with the Switch 2 weighing in at 556, and the Steam Deck being the heaviest by far, being a whopping 678 grams. There really isn't anything to dislike. The controller is amazing, the touchscreen is big and responsive, and it even lets you use the touchpad by double tapping the screen right under the joysticks on either side. Honestly, while this device falls short on almost every single thing, ergonomics and design is where it can show its true potential, and for that, it gets a 5 out of 5. On the complete opposite side of that, in terms of ergonomics, you really can't get much worse than the Switch 2. It's extremely thin and flat, with nothing to hold on to, so it's hard to get a grip on, and the rectangular shape doesn't lend itself very well to ergonomics either. And surprisingly, for the first time since the GameCube, there is no gimmick for the Switch 2, besides it being more powerful. No, I don't count the mouse feature because nobody cares. Which kinda works, as the power is such a large upgrade from its predecessor, and it's pretty much what everyone wanted, a stronger Nintendo Switch. Same handheld and home console concept, just more powerful and better overall. The larger Joy-Con make it more comfortable for adult hands, as well as having the SR and SL buttons easier to access. Not to mention it looks less like a toy now and more like a respectable console. If you brought the original Switch to the office, you would get funny looks, but you bring the Switch 2 and you're getting numbers. It didn't really do anything new nor set itself apart by being very comfortable. And due to this, I think it only deserves a score of a 3 out of 5. In order to test portability, I figured the best way to test it would be going to a local park, which is why this table is so disgusting. And the Steam Deck, in terms of portability, is probably the easiest to pick up and take with you, because every single Steam Deck that's sold comes with this carrying case, which is nice for your peace of mind when tossing it into a bag to bring along, with the only downside being the thickness of the carrying case. But the system itself is also pretty large, so it's just as difficult to carry around with you. And to test each of these systems, we'll be playing Minecraft, as it shouldn't cause any issues while running, and it runs the same offline as it would online, with little to no issues. But the form factor of the Steam Deck, with it being so long and bulky, kind of causes some difficulty when trying to bring it with you on the go. The inclusion of the carrying case that you can just toss it into sort of mitigates the complaints I have about the size, because it's so easy to just carry around with the case, and for that, I feel like the Steam Deck deserves a 4 out of 5, because even though it can't be thrown into a pocket, it can still be brought around in a bag extremely easily. The PS Portal, as with most things, falls very short of the standard of portability. Not only is an internet connection required to use this thing, but you need a really strong connection to have a good experience. And while I was loading into Minecraft, it decided it didn't want to recognize my hotspot, and if you're in a place with bad internet, there's a chance that you don't get to play on it at all. The connection to the console is actually pretty quick, but if you have to keep connecting, that time adds up and it gets really old really quick. The games also have an enormous amount of latency, which is to be expected, I guess, but man, it is really noticeable. At some points, you can see me take my finger off the joystick before it even starts to respond. The design of this thing isn't really that good at being portable either, as while it is thin and the controllers are comfortable, they are absolutely massive, and if you put this thing in a bag, you'll be worried about getting drift or scratching your screen. So the PlayStation Portal is not portable at all, and for that, I'm gonna say it gets a 1 out of 5. The Switch 2 has no issues playing games on the go, as that's what it's meant for, so we can just talk about the actual portability. It is much more thin than the Steam Deck, but the size of this thing is pretty big, so it's not going to be fitting in anyone's pocket either, especially when you attach the Joy-Con, as that adds a few extra inches. And with Nintendo's neglect toward their controller, I doubt anyone would feel comfortable enough to throw it into a bag unprotected. However, in the current age of portable gaming, I would say that this is unfortunately one of the more portable systems, so it's gonna get a 4 out of 5. And considering all three systems, I would say that in today's definition of portable gaming, are these devices even portable now? We've gotten so caught up in the performance and power of these systems that we don't care about the actual portability of our handhelds, and it unfortunately shows. Now we're getting into the part that most people want to know. Performance is one of, if not the most important component of whether or not you're willing to spend your money on a device like these. And in order to test the performance of these systems, I devised a system of my own. And while I may not be a big fan of most modern games, I recognize that they are essential when it comes to testing the performance of a device. But due to my lack of interest in them, I tend to not have any of them in my collection. So instead of testing Cyberpunk on any of these devices, I decided that I could test a myriad of games, each of which fall into one of these categories: indie, online multiplayer, graphically demanding, and Minecraft, because everyone plays Minecraft. And I feel like that should cover the majority of games that most people play. Starting with Enter the Gungeon, this game is gonna run well on almost anything. The main point of this test is to see how well it handles a lot of particles being on the screen at once. But it seems like this game is so well optimized that there aren't really any issues on any system. The game is also extremely easy to run, so that is another factor. The next game, however, is Fortnite, which the Steam Deck cannot play, so it won't be included in this comparison. While almost every version of Fortnite has the ability to turn on an FPS counter, the Switch 2 version does not, for some reason, have the ability because they removed it from the shameful Switch 1 port and said they won't bring it back for the Switch 2. However, both systems run the game at a locked 60 FPS with little to no fluctuation. The main difference between the two is that the PS Portal version does look a little bit better than the Switch 2, but besides that, they are almost identical. To test a multiplayer online game on the Steam Deck, I decided Dead by Daylight would be a good candidate, and I chose to contrast it against the Switch version. There really isn't anything nice I can say about the Switch version. It is absolute garbage, but I won't count it against the Switch 2 because it's a Switch 1 game, and the Switch 2 does make it run at a steady 30 FPS, which is what it's locked to. The Steam Deck runs the game perfectly though, with nice looking graphics and a good frame rate, but there is one really bad thing about it. That battery life is abysmal, and you won't really get to play much of the game if you run it at these settings, so that's very unfortunate. Also, it cranks the fan way up. Just listen to how loud this is. And the Switch 2's fan is practically silent. My last issue with this game on the Steam Deck is that its heat is very noticeable while playing in handheld mode, but besides that, it's an amazing way to play DBD. Minecraft. It's a game that needs no introduction, as I'm sure you've heard of it, and the performance on these systems is actually pretty interesting. The Steam Deck, although not running on a Microsoft operating system, runs it pretty well. There are a few stutters, but the game looks pretty dang good, and once you played for a bit, the stutters are almost non-existent, so it is a pretty nice way to play. And you would think the PS Portal would play the best, but the PS5 version of Minecraft has vibrant visuals, which is pretty much ray tracing. And since the PS5 is so far ahead of the other two systems, I figured I could even the playing field a bit by making it run with that enabled, and it did not run very good. There was a lot of stutter at first until I turned the render distance down, but even then it would have some frame loss and stutter a bit. I would say that despite this version being the best looking, it definitely runs the worst. The Switch version, which is only a Switch 1 game, runs surprisingly well, although the render distance is only 16 blocks. The game looks pretty alright, just with a little less detail than the Steam Deck, and is a steady 30 FPS, which doesn't feel too bad. Minecraft is pretty playable on almost anything, so this isn't really surprising. Anyway, on to the next and final category. Yeah, I didn't choose to place something that can be tested on every system. Rather, I wanted to show what these things are capable of, so I chose to play a game that is exclusive or best played on that system. But I also wanted it to challenge the system a bit. So, for the Steam Deck, Mortal Shell. This game runs pretty well in the tutorial, but once you get into the actual game, the frames drop from 60 down to the 30s and 40s. But it's completely playable, and it looks great too. The battery starts at 60% when I load the game, and after 10 minutes of playing, got down to 46, which shows just how bad this battery is, as well as the fan being terribly loud. But the performance of the game itself is pretty good. For the PS Portal, Miles Morales. This game is running on a PS5, so it runs really well, and the PS Portal isn't doing the whole running the game thing, so that's to be expected. Moving on, the Switch 2 is going to be playing Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. The game looks great, and the game runs at a steady 60 FPS, and the loading times are extremely short. This is how the game was intended to be played, as the Switch's lack of power caused tons of stutter and lowered frame rate. But the Switch 2 does have a heat problem when playing on a high resolution and dock docked mode, but unless you're sitting right next to it, you won't hear the fan and you won't feel the heat unless you played in handheld mode right after playing in 1440p or 4K. There isn't really much I can complain about with this game as it's optimized really well and runs perfectly for this hardware. So, let's get on to the performance scores. All in all, the Steam Deck gets a well-earned 4 out of 5, the PlayStation Portal gets a saddening 2 out of 5, and the youngest child, the Nintendo Switch 2, gets an impressive 4 out of 5. I'm sure this is the moment you've been waiting for all video, and if you've skipped here, I will find you and maul you to death. After considering all of my previously voiced thoughts, I've added some final scores together, and they may not be what you expect. In order of last to first place, the scores are a 14 out of 25 for the PlayStation Portal, an 18 out of 25 for the Nintendo Switch 2, and in first place, to probably no surprise, is the Steam Deck, with a respectable 20 out of 25. This is actually not the outcome I had expected. To be honest, I was hoping the Switch 2 would win, and I know I could have rigged this for that to be the case, but I wanted to stay as objective as possible. And I hope that you got some helpful information from this video. And if you disagree with my ranking, let me know in the comments. So if you want a TLDR of this video, I think the Basement Dwellers are right, just buy a Steam Deck.